into the rest of Douglas Week, basically to remind you that this is part of, well, this is day 2 of Douglas Week now, and we're going all the way through Sunday with a whole range of events, some of them musical and creative and artistic, and I won't go on about them now, but you can find these all at our website, douglasincork.com, where you can also browse the events, sign up for everything for free, and read more about the event overall. I should also say that for your information, this event, as well as all the other events throughout the week, will be recorded and available for viewing in the coming days, so please be aware of that. And I think that's everything. I'll hand over to Sarah to mention anything that I've missed, and welcome to the event.
Thank you very much, Tim. Yeah, I'm Sarah Mccready, also in the School of English, almost doctor, not quite doctor like my esteemed colleagues. I just want to say a few things as well about housekeeping. So just to remember to be respectful of our panelists and conduct yourself online as you would in person. And there's also a Q&A box function in which you can submit questions for our contributors. And we'll be monitoring this closely throughout the event, and we'll pass any questions you might have on to the panelists. And if you have any more specific questions for our organising team, you can email us directly at info@douglasincork.com. So thank you very much for being here. And I think we're going to be watching a video before we begin the event. Isn't that right, Caroline?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I hope you enjoy. I hope you enjoy Douglas Week. Before I now hand over to Brenda Malone, who is our panel chair, our roundtable chair today. She's a historian and museum professional at the National Museum of Ireland, where she has been curating both historical and folklife collections since 2000, I believe. And before I hand over to Brenda now, we would like to share with you a very wonderful and warm video message from the Lord Mayor of Cork, Councillor Joe Kavanagh, who will also join us later for this panel. So bear with me as I now share my screen with you to show you the video. Give me 1 second. All right, so I'll share the video now.
Hello, my name is Councillor Joe Kavanagh, and I am the Lord Mayor of Cork. I'm delighted to welcome you to Cork, where Frederick Douglass, among many other Black abolitionists, travelled to find refuge and build support for the anti-slavery cause in America. I'm joining you today from my chamber in Cork City Hall. Cork and the surrounding area played an important role during Frederick Douglass's visit in 1845. We're proud to know that Douglass very much enjoyed his stay in Cork and formed friendships here that would last for the rest of his long and illustrious life. I'm happy to note that in 2012, we placed a plaque to Douglass here in Cork at the Imperial Hotel, where Douglass spoke on at least one occasion to mark the support he found from the Cork anti-slavery societies. In September 1845, Douglass lectured in Dublin and travelled through Wexford and Waterford. He spent 3 weeks in Cork in October, giving at least 9 public lectures, and another in the nearby town of Youghal, to packed halls across the city on the topic of slavery. At the time, Cork was home to an important and active abolitionist movement that challenged the slave trade and was instrumental in inviting and hosting Frederick Douglass. Voices in Cork spoke out against the oppression and exploitation that underpinned the institution of racialized slavery. As an Atlantic port city, Cork at the time was very much interconnected with Atlantic port cities in the US, and Douglass commented on this in many of his speeches. In Cork, on October the 20th, 1845, for example, Douglass states that my words, feeble as they are, when spoken at home, will wax stronger in proportion to the distance I go from home, as a lever gains power by its distance from the fulcrum. Ireland, Cork, and America are of course interconnected today in many different ways, and indeed share challenges around issues like inclusion, race, and acceptance that have become so much a part of the dialogue in Cork and all of Ireland today. Cork has many initiatives around diversity, including sanctuary runners, City of Sanctuary movement, intercultural dialogues around Black Lives Matters, engaging with migrant youth, and celebrating many cultural events and festivals, showcasing the diverse and multicultural city that Cork has become. We have run campaigns to include our new communities in the civic life of the city through Shape Your City, a local election initiative encouraging all residents of the city to vote and run for local office. Indeed, at our last local elections, we had 3 non-Irish nationals running for office, reflecting the increasing positive contribution of migrants to our city. We support our LBGT 1+ communities through interagency groups, promoting annual awareness weeks, and support Cork Pride Festival every year. Cork City Council is proud to have achieved Rainbow City status for Cork City in 2020. The culmination and recognition of the proactive policies of the city in promoting and supporting our LBGT 1+ allies. I'm very happy to be part of this week of activities and to tune in to many of the events happening during Douglass Week. I'm inspired by the warm welcome Douglass received here in Cork, and I hope that his story is inspiring, and it's inspiring to you and other Douglass Week attendees also. In bidding farewell to the people of Cork on the 3rd of November 1845, Douglass not only thanks them for their hospitality, but also praises the city's journalists who duly reported that by means of the press, his words would be borne across the Atlantic and startled the slaveholders in their cruelty and wickedness. On that note, thank you to the Douglass Week team for all of their work, and thank you for joining me for this event and your support of Douglass Week.
Thank you so much to the Lord Mayor of Cork, Joe Kavanagh, and I'll hand over now to Brenda. There you go, Brenda. You're up.
Okay, thanks very much. First of all, I'd like to say thanks very much for inviting me to chair this panel. It's a really exciting opportunity. Sorry, hang on a second. Can you see me now? Yeah, so thanks very much for having me. It's so exciting to be here today with people who are working in this area. We all work in very different ways, I think, so it's really a great opportunity to get us together and talk about our different practices. I would be more on the side of collecting, whereas others are more collection and display, and others more in education programming. As was said earlier, I'm the curator of military history, but I have actually been working quite consistently on collecting more contemporary history objects into the National Museum. Back when I was a folklife curator, I concentrated on industrial and reformatory school system material. And then since 2018, we formally made the Contemporary Ireland collection, which came about with the collection of the Repeal the Eight material. And then we backtracked, because there was no collection before that, to collect the 2015 marriage referendum material culture. And then since then, I've been working quite intensively on trying to get the material culture of the Magdalen laundry system and some other baby home material as well. So as I said, we all have very different, we all approach this quite differently, and we're all at quite different stages. I think it's important to recognize that that this is a never-ending process, and it's not something that you just do and you tick the box and it's done. So we're always looking for new ways to expand. We're, experimenting is almost the way of doing it in this case, because because we don't know what is going to come up next in terms of what is going to happen in this country's history, or how this country fits into the history of the world that's happening around us. So I'm excited to introduce, first of all, Simon O'Connor, who's the director of MOLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland, a collaboration between University College Dublin and the National Library of Ireland. The museum is housed in an original home of UCD, Newman House, and a spectacular collection of period buildings right in the middle of Dublin. Simon is the first director of the museum, overseeing the creation of a major contribution to the cultural landscape, as well as its organisation and curatorial structures. A composer by training, Simon O'Connor was the founding curator of the Little Museum of Dublin, building the museum from scratch in 2011 and managing its highly ambitious exhibition programme, winning many national and international awards along the way. He has worked across the arts and creative sector and continues to be active. I'm going to pass you all over now to Simon.
Hi. For asking me along this afternoon. So I'll tell you a little bit, I suppose, just by way of introduction, about tell you a little bit about MOLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland. I just wonder, can everyone see my screen there? I've just shared a little presentation. Is that clear enough for people can see it? So essentially, MOLI is a collaboration between University College Dublin and the National Library of Ireland. So it's a new museum of literature that was established in, really the project has been going on since about 2012, in development since then, and then we opened in 2019. It's located, as Brenda mentioned, in a really spectacular suite of buildings on St. Stephen's Green, the UCD Naughton Joyce Centre, Newman House, which was the original home of the university. And as the university kind of gradually developed its footprint out in Belfield, I think there was a sense that perhaps Newman House could have been put to a kind of a greater public use. So the Naughton Foundation came on board in 2013 with funding of €5 million toward the project. Fáilte Ireland followed with funding of €2.5 million, and then the university raised the remaining €3 million to get the project completed. So it was quite a large restoration of the houses on the site, as well as creating access across the entire site for visitors. And we opened in 2019. We worked with Scott Talon Walker, architects here in Dublin, and Ralph Applebaum Associates, the exhibition designers in London, who went about helping us creating those exhibitions. So, and it's a really interesting mix of both new, I suppose, very high-tech, interactive exhibits, alongside treasures from the National Library's literary collections, with a particular focus within the permanent exhibitions on the works of Joyce. The museum's vision, I suppose, is quite ambitious. Our goal really is to establish ourselves at the forefront of literary museums internationally, and then to bring our visitors on what we hope is an inspiring journey through Irish writing, past and present, but also continuing to encourage them to explore their own creative potential. And driving all of the work in the museum is a very strong philosophy of public engagement and access. So to that end, we have a very busy temporary exhibition schedule in the first year of opening, some of which included a global pandemic shutdown. We had 5 temporary exhibitions, and we continue to plan out over the next couple of years for temporary exhibitions as well. We have an awful lot of work going on the learning side. We have free to access schools learning programs, which actually, since the pandemic, have been dramatically expanded digitally. And we work very closely with local schools on the continuous development of these, as well as partnering with youth and community groups to access harder to reach young people. One of the kind of the more interesting components of our curatorial side is this very hyperactive digital platform that we created called Radio MOLI, which acts as both a recording facility within the museum for the literary community at large, as well as a kind of a growing public archive of digital literary material that's available online and promoted by us online as well. The museum also has, as well as kind of a reasonably large staff base, we also have a considerable volunteer program, which is mostly populated by retired alumni of UCD who have very strong emotional connections to the buildings that we're in. So they spend a lot of their time in those buildings simply chatting to visitors about the history of the space before the museum was there. And then I suppose kind of more relevant to the conversation we'll be having this afternoon, access is very central to our curatorial mission as well. So we would see the museum as playing a major role in addressing the, I suppose, a strong gender bias in the public perception of Ireland's literary history. We also feel an obligation to continuously broaden the general public sense of what Irish writing is. So to take the capital L out of literature and to look at folk forms, traveller writing, song, cross-disciplinary work, rap, digital writing, spoken word, as well as word-based creative activity from new Irish communities. Just on a final note, I suppose we've had the kind of luxurious tabula rasa of building this museum from scratch. So for us, that's been a golden opportunity to consider the museum both curatorially and organizationally as a kind of holistic whole, from a governance and from an ethical perspective. And we hope that that the ethical and the access component of our curatorial approach are mirrored within the organizational systems of the museum as a business as well.
Okay, thanks so much, Simon, for that. And I'll be coming back to you in a little bit about some questions I have. That was great, thank you. Next up, I'd like to introduce Dr. Danielle O'Donovan. And Danielle is the Programme Manager of Nano Nagle Place, which is a 3.5-acre heritage site comprising Georgian convent buildings and Victorian schools and a chapel set in extensive walled gardens. The on-site museum tells the story of Nano Nagle, an educationalist who founded schools during the penal era and established the Presentation Sisters. The aim of the museum is to tell the story of the past while continuing to fight for social justice in the present. And Danielle's research interest spans architectural history and creative education. So I'm going to pass you over to Danielle
now. Thank you so much, Brenda. I'm about to share my screen. I hope you'll be able to see it. Here we go. Can everybody see that? 1 second, share. Can you see it, guys?
It's coming up. Yeah, we got it, Danielle. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Right. Brenda, thank you so much for the introduction. It's great to be here today. So as Brenda said, you know, I just want to introduce Nano Nagle Place and what we do now. We are a beautiful complex of walled organic convent gardens, Georgian buildings, a Victorian chapel, and old school buildings. The place where Nano Nagle began her work in the 1750s. We're a site of living heritage, we're a place-based museum. So in 2014, actually, the convents on the site and the schools and much of the complex was running towards dereliction. The schools had closed in the late 90s and early 2000s. And there needed to be a new vision for the site. And the Presentation Sisters appointed a voluntary board and they went on to regenerate the whole site. So those Georgian convents, the oldest of which is 250 years old this year, the old school buildings and the chapel. And so we now house a beautiful museum that tells the story of Nano Nagle in the Victorian chapel. And then those Georgian convent buildings still are home to sisters, which makes it a site of living heritage, but much of them is given over to community education. So as a site of heritage, we tell the story of Nano Nagle in the past, and we continue her work, as Brenda said, in the present. So I just wanted to take a moment to consider Nano Nagle as an activist, and I'm trying to advance my slides and they're not moving. So maybe I just need to click on them. No, oh, I see, I've got little arrows. So just to think about Nano Nagle as an activist, well, not in the dictionary sense is she an activist, because she didn't publicly campaign. In fact, she did everything in secret. It's one of the most intriguing things about her. And for a woman in the 18th century, she did it in a really rather a radical way. She didn't ask permission for anybody to do anything, her family or the bishop or anyone. She didn't really ask for forgiveness. she just opened 7 schools for poor children. She built 2 convents. She invited the Ursuline sisters to Cork. She founded the Presentation Sisters, and she built an almshouse. And so she did it all in secret because it was illegal to do those things at the time. A Catholic education, a Catholic communities of worship were outlawed. I love this picture of Nano Nagle because we don't have any material from the past of her campaigning, but it's in 1809, somebody commissioned this lovely mezzotint from quite a famous mezzotint artist in London called Charles Turner. And it's holding her up as the foundress of the Ursuline and it says visitation, but it's say presentation convents in Cork. And it's very kind of visually telling the story of Nano Nagle. What did she do? She taught little girls how to work. So there's a child sewing, how to read. So how to read and be educated, and how to pray. So she taught them to how to practice their religion. And in the background, you can see a bookshelf hidden by a curtain, which implies, that learning, that her knowledge and her work had to be done in secret. So what do? We tell the story of Nano Nagle. Whoops, I went a bit forward there. In this beautiful kind of interactive museum, Nano Nagle and the Presentation Sisters. And we are a museum. We're not a heritage centre, so we collect. So we collect items from convents all over Ireland as they sadly close down. We collect from past pupils. So you can see here past pupils in the chapel with a photograph that they brought in, and they're modelling with their old school photograph. So we also, I think this is maybe the interesting bit, and appropriately for a museum devoted to Nano Nagle, it's a museum kind of run by educationalists. We don't actually have a curator. The education department or the program department run the museum and the programming and the exhibitions. And so we use the story of Nano Nagle to inspire activism in the present. So you can see here this actress, Judy Chalmers, who through research created a dramatic persona of Nano Nagle, and she goes out to visit schools all around the country, or during the pandemic, she's been Zooming them, which is very contemporary. And she asked students, if you were at Nano Nagle, if Nano Nagle were here now, what would she do? And so the idea is to spark activism, and these students from this school did things like they danced for Stand Up to Cancer, they raised money for penny dinners. So the story of Nano is a catalyst for activism in the present. We also like to host, we have quite a lot of space here on the site. So we were delighted to host Climate Youth Action, who were working with students to create campaign materials for the big climate marches that were happening and that were planned for the early in 2020. So we not only work to inspire activism through Nano, but to host and to say yes to as much activism as we can on site. We're also home to 2 charities, and they're the people who are really continuing Nano's work for social justice and for looking after marginalised people. So these are participants of the Lantern Community Project, which is a project for people who for different circumstances feel marginalised, and they're welcomed to the Lantern Project, where there's kind of empowering community education activities that give people a sense of solidarity and a sense of community. We also have Cork Migrant Centre on site, and anybody who is engaging with the Douglass Week programme will probably have seen so much of what they're going to contribute this week. They work to improve the lives of migrants in Cork through education and through creativity. So we see here the migrant teens, the hip hop group. A lot of these teens are living in direct provision, and so the Migrant Centre work with them to bring them in and to do things from helping them with their homework to teaching them hip hop. And a picture of Dr. Naomi Mccready with her women's group there. Again, lots of people coming in from direct provision to kind of work in entrepreneurial ways to make their lives better. And which leads us here, I guess, so is Dr. Naomi Mccready and Fionnuala O'Connell, and we're delighted to be part of Douglass Week and to be part of this conversation. So thank you so much, and thank you to Simon and MOLI for lending us the exhibition that's here in Cork right now.
That's great. Thanks so much, Danielle, for that. It's really interesting. We'll be covering a few of those points, I think, later. In the meantime, I'm going to introduce Hannah Crowdy. Hannah Crowdy is the head of curatorial at the National Museums Northern Ireland, which is Northern Ireland's foremost cultural and heritage museum group. With a background in social history, curation and collections interpretation, she has been in her current role there since 2017 and takes a leading role in the organisation's work on contested histories, the legacy of the past and decolonisation. And she is a member of the Ethics Committee for the UK Museums Association. So I'm going to hand you over to Hannah.
Great. Thank you very much, Brenda, and thank you for the invitation to be part of Douglass Week, and also congratulations to the team who've put together such a fantastic programme for everyone this week. I'm also going to share my screen just for a short presentation. So just to talk about who we are as an organisation, National Museums NI is quite a big beast of an organisation. We run 4 museums, which are the Ulster Museum in Belfast, which is in the top left there, the Ulster Folk Museum at Cultra, which you can see to the right, with which brings together a number of original and replica buildings from across Ulster. The Ulster American Folk Park at the bottom left, where you can see the candle making, and that's in Omagh. And then the Ulster Transport Museum, which is the Irish National Transport Collection. So we have a very large remit. We are responsible for around 1.4 million objects in our collections, which cut across art, history and natural science. And that is just our vision there as an organisation, to celebrate who we are, telling the stories of our past, challenging our present and shaping our future. And I think in particular, the present and the future bit are really key there. It won't be a surprise to anyone working in museums, but I think often the perception is that museums are just about the past. And we feel it's as important, arguably more important, that we help people to understand who we are as a society today, and also that everyone has a stake in this place that we live, and everyone has a stake in the future, and we're encouraging people to get involved and be active in that. We're particularly known as an organisation for our work on contested histories, and I think that's particularly relevant when we talk about activism. So it's about contested histories. It's also about the legacy of the past in Northern Ireland and how people understand that and how we live with it today. So some of the ways in which we do that, being a museum, we obviously have gallery spaces. The Troubles and Beyond gallery, you can see there, is a fairly new gallery that we opened in 2018 on the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. And that really helps people to understand that the decades of the Troubles and has been informed and added to by a major collecting project, whereby we've gone out and spoken to people and radically extended our collection relating to the Troubles. And it's critical really for us that that exhibition is called The Troubles and Beyond, because it's beyond in the recognition that things didn't suddenly just stop in 1998 and everything changed. In some ways, we are still dealing with the legacy of the past, and there are still issues in our society. And also we recognise that the beyond, the Troubles and that period in our history isn't just about conflict. There's so much more to people's lives and experiences at that time. We also do it through our art collections, and the top image in the middle is an exhibition called Art of the Troubles, which we showed in 2014 and drew both on our own collections and those from other major collections, such as the Imperial War Museum. We are obviously a collecting institution, so we go out and we collect material, and you can see us here out in a library talking to the community, trying to gather more kind of contemporary and social history for our collections. And then I think it's really critical that museums can't ever be truly activist if they just work on their own. A lot of our best work comes from working in partnership. So as well as working with the public, which you can see there, the large image at the bottom is from an art exhibition that we showed called Silent Testimony. And that's a partnership between us as the museum, Colin Davidson as the artist, and an organisation called Wave Trauma, who represent victims and survivors of the Troubles. And it's a really powerful exhibition of 18 people who have suffered loss or injury as a result of the conflict. And in its own way, I think the exhibition could be seen as activist. Also, someone like Colin, the artist, is very activist in the way he conducts himself. And for example, he takes a real kind of proactive role in fighting for the injured pension in Northern Ireland. And then at the bottom, you can see Mairead Corrigan Maguire, who was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 1976 for her activist work in support of peace in Northern Ireland. So again, it's never just us, it's always the people that we're working with, and I think they make us so much better at what we do. We also have a couple of active projects, which are arguably activist projects. The first one is called Making the Future, and it's a Peace for funded project. And its strapline is that everyone has a story, everyone has a voice, everyone has a future. And it's very much about using museum collections and archives to explore the past and to create a powerful vision for future change. And it's a cross-border project as well. So with that project, we work with lots of different people, and the exhibition that you can see there, Culture Lab, I think that whole concept of don't believe the stereotype is really at the heart of Making the Future. It's trying to understand our shared history, to encourage empathy and understanding between different people, and in some ways to take a slightly fun and provocative look at who we are, and those sometimes quite ingrained and damaging stereotypes that we have. And then the other project is called Reimagine, Remake, Replay. It's funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and it's about connecting young people and heritage in new ways, particularly using digital and new technologies. And young people, we find, are very, very activist in their approach, which is great because it kind of pushes us in ways I don't think we would necessarily go, or we would go very slowly on our own. So for example, as you can see there, they've been very vocal about trans rights, about gender equality, lots of different issues that are getting their voices into the museum in a way we wouldn't have otherwise. I just wanted to mention decolonization because it's increasingly important in the work that we do. I've got it there in inverted commas because it's still a word that I don't think is completely resolved in museums, and there's some anxiety about it. But this idea of kind of challenging injustice and bringing these stories to the fore that we have been hidden or ignored is so important to us. And so activism isn't just about our very contemporary history and how we collect and respond to that. It can be how we look at the past as well. So, for example, at our Ulster American Folk Park site, traditionally, we've told very celebratory stories of people who emigrated to North America and were very successful in what they did. And now we're just trying to interrogate that a bit more and look at the impact on, for example, people who were enslaved or Indigenous people, and what are the legacies of that, and just give this more fuller view of history, more challenging view. And then I think this is something we're going to touch on in our discussion, but there's this kind of rallying cry today that museums are not neutral, which I would say is a good thing, but it's not something everyone wants to come on that journey with us. Some people are pleased to see that in the museum, and some people see it almost as a very threat to what a museum is and what a museum represents. So I think that's something that is a very useful ongoing discussion, but just something to be mindful of in what we do. And then just the last thing I wanted to say is that Frederick Douglass visited Belfast as well in 1845 and is much admired there too, as he is in Cork and many other places. So here he is on a mural just off the Falls Road in Belfast. And also we heard at the end of last year that Belfast City Council have approved for the creation of a statue to commemorate Frederick Douglass. So just really pleased to be part of this event and to give a bit of a Northern Irish perspective on the work that we're doing in museums. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much for that, Hannah. And you've brought up a couple of really interesting points that we'll come back to later. Just for the moment, I wanted to go back to ask each of you a question that has kind of come up during your presentations. I just wanted to start with Simon, but maybe the host could unmute all of the panelists at this point. So Simon, I was just wondering, what role can activism play in a literary museum? And what opportunities do you think your museum has in this area, especially considering it's almost brand new and you have this opportunity to almost form an identity?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be, and to kind of throw a cat amongst the pigeons, I tend to be quite wary of the term activism in the context of our work in the museum. I think because for some audiences, it can presuppose a specific political position, as opposed to sometimes what the activity is actually related to, which is an ethical or a moral position. I see the work in our museum, I suppose, as having more of an ethical and philosophical underpinning that's rooted within globally recognized concepts of sustainable development and human rights. I think as a literary museum, one of the things that's interesting is that we are a museum of an art form, and the connection to history or chronology is more of an organizing structure than it would be in a history museum, which I think is more proximate to politics than necessarily our subject matter is. So within the literary museum, like our subject matter, the subject matter of the art form is psychology and philosophy and human relationships and identity and all of these things. And I think really where our role as a museum is to contextualize that art form for people. And sometimes that means putting it in the context of social history, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just purely about the artworks itself. But I would see that that wholesale embracing of activism as a term, although some of the work that we might do might be perceived as activist, I wouldn't perceive it as activist at all. I'd see it as simply just the exploration of ethical and moral ideas.
Just then maybe just to the rest of the panel as well, maybe what we should have started with is just what exactly does the term activism mean to you when it comes to your practice, at least? And do you ever regard maybe your practice itself as being a form of activism in itself?
I tend to think of education as activism because it's about opening up people's minds and challenging them to think about things in different ways. And we're a museum run by an education department. So that kind of idea of, challenging people to look at things from multiple perspectives, or to be inspired by somebody else's story. Are we an activist museum? I don't know. There is a very large panel as you walk into the museum that talks about the work of Nano and the Presentation Sisters, and says in the face of fear they chose to be brave, and various things. And then at the bottom it says, what will you do? So I think actually possibly we are an activist museum with that statement in mind.
Yeah, I would say we're probably not an activist museum. I think we dip our toes in activism. But I don't think it's at the very kind of center of what we do at the moment. That may change over time. And I think it was interesting what Simon was saying, that is it activism, or is that just kind of a ethical and moral imperative to what we do? And I think certain things we do is that we collect activist material, but does that mean we're activists ourselves? Not necessarily. We provide a platform for people who have activist views, and we provide that space for debate and discussion. Again, does that mean we're activists? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. I was reading about activism in museums, and I can't remember exactly where this quote was from, but it says it's about museums acknowledging and harnessing the role we play in society. So it's almost like we do have a responsibility to step up in certain ways if we feel that we are important in society, if we feel we are relevant. And it's about taking a stand against prejudice, against discrimination, against injustice. And there's different ways we can do that. So I think a lot of what we do in museums is almost indirect activism, if that makes sense, that we provide space for different voices and perspectives, which is absolutely what we should be doing. And it may not be about activism, it may just be that gradual democratizing, well, it's gradual for us, probably newer museums get it right more than we do, but that kind of democratization of museums, that museums belong to everyone and everyone has a stake in them, and everyone has a say in what happens in them.
Yeah, I would think that, I suppose, with both the National Museums in Northern Ireland and the National Museum of Ireland, were both very long-standing institutions that had very set remits. For over 100 years, we've known exactly what we do. And I think it's only really in recent decades that things have begun to expand out over those very controlled edges that we've always had. But yeah, I think I would agree that I think we are spaces where activism can take place, and we record that or reflect that. But I also think as well, like yourself, that we belong to the people. The museums belong to the people that they serve, and therefore when a community acts in a certain way, then we are part of that. Any concern that concerns the communities, we should be part of that and reflecting that as well. But you did mention ethics there, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your activities and the work of the Ethics Committee for the UK Museums Association, and how maybe you think collecting and curating activism forms part of museum ethics. You might have answered that a little bit already, but
yeah, I think there's this growing awareness that ethics actually kind of runs through everything we do in museums. There's quite a traditional view that you kind of think about ethics if you're thinking, should we or shouldn't we dispose of something from the collection, and how do we do that, or should we or shouldn't we accept sponsorship from this organization. But actually, again, coming back to that kind of public social remit of museums, it is much more about kind of engagement and how we connect with audiences. And so I think the fact that it is embedded in, it's embedded in the Code of Ethics of the Museums Association, and also codes of ethics such as the one that International Council of Museums has. It gives us real support for this kind of practice in what we do. It's a bit of an incentive because I think some people worry about, is it the right thing to do? Is this us getting too political? And again, if there's that support in ethical codes, it can be encouraging for people. It can often help us be a bit of a justification if we do get that pushback from the public, saying, you're a museum, you shouldn't be doing this. And actually we can say, yes, we absolutely should be doing this. It's part of what we are. So I think the key bit in the Museums Association Code of Ethics is about supporting freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and respecting the right of all to express different views within the museum. So that's how we can be activist in kind of in line with good ethical practice. It's also about working in partnership with audiences and communities who have already said bring their own activist views and activities to the museum. And one of the things that's just become increasingly apparent to our organisation is that those sector-wide codes are really useful for us. But actually we need something that is bespoke to our own context and our own situation. So we have just developed our own ethics policy, and it includes in there, for example, about promoting good relations and about building social cohesion and reconciliation, which are just critical for us in Northern Ireland. So again, I think ethics just provides that bedrock for that practice. It supports us, and it's what we should be doing.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I have to say sometimes that I do think that the National Museums in Northern Ireland are kind of certainly steps ahead of us in terms of we might be collecting, but you are already at the step of interpretation and displaying. Do you think it's that requirement, that need to be inclusive and to bring communities together, given Northern Ireland's particular history, and that maybe Peace Corps funding kind of almost depends on being inclusive? Do you think that's given you an opportunity to really kind of push that and be that?
Yeah, it definitely has. It has given us that opportunity. It has really kind of encouraged us. So there's been the peace funding. We've also had National Lottery Heritage funding for projects such as Collecting the Troubles and beyond. And through that funding, we've taken a very kind of gradual approach, but each step of the way we've consulted with the public. And generally, we've had a really positive response saying this is what the museum should be doing. We respect and trust the museum. The museum is the right place for this. So I think we've just increased in confidence as we've gone on. I mean, I've been in the organisation 11 years, and even in that time, I think we've made huge strides. But yes, that funding and that kind of the equality legislation we have here and that need to promote peace and reconciliation are definitely big drivers for us.
Yeah. Danielle, I have to come on to you with a question that I've been wanting to ask you for a long time now. I was wondering, in your work in Nano Nagle Place, with communities especially, do say the current discussions about the role of the Catholic Church in Irish society and their institutions in the past, does that ever impact on your practice and your day-to-day programming and experience in Nano Nagle Place?
Increasingly, I think, you know, we're such a new museum. We only opened halfway through 2017 and we launched in just at the end of December 2017. And I guess, you know, in the first flush of wanting to get people through the door, you're so enthusiastic and getting out there and presenting. And I remember presenting at the Catholic Records Association in Dublin, and was enthusing about loads of the things that we do, you know, educational innovation and trying to work with diverse communities. And there was an academic I knew in the audience, and she took me aside after and said, Danielle, it can't all be good. It can't all be good, you know. And it kind of, you know, I've been reflecting on that since, and it struck me that we really have to be open to collecting the complex in a way. We have to collect everything. It's tricky because, you know, I think I showed the facade of our building, and it's a big red brick institutional facade that some people, we may never get them to cross it. Some people do cross that facade and they come into front reception and they say, I hated it here. I hated coming to schools here. It was awful, you know. And I think it's capturing that dissent that we need to really work hard on. So we have been crowdsourcing, we've been asking people to come, but inevitably the people who are going to come very quickly are the people who have positive memories or positive stories, and trying to root out the more complex stories are what we need to really work hard on now, because I think they're all relevant to the building. And as a place-based museum, you kind of want to inhabit the building with as many people's memories as possible, good or bad, because that's what gives it meaning. That's what's going to give it meaning into the future. And particularly think that we've been talking about oral history for a while, because we're really conscious that the communities who are associated with this building are aging, whether it's past pupils, you know, who went to school here in the 50s or 60s or 40s, and then the sisters who again are an aging population, and we want to kind of capture all of their perspectives. I think it's like organising ourselves. I have to have a conversation with you, Hannah, about ethics and how you go about taking those oral histories and storing them properly and making sure that we go about it in the right way. I think that the past pupil community is fascinating, and they're very connected to, there's a real sense of ownership. We have people who volunteer here who have said that their school experience wasn't that good, but they've come back anyway, which is interesting. And I'd love to imagine in the future an exhibition maybe curated by the past pupils that gives their perspective, you know, on the site and on the history of the site and what education has been like over time. So watch this space, because I think we're now that we've kind of found our feet, we'll be looking to collect the complex.
Yeah, great. And we've kind of touched on this as well, but it's a good opportunity maybe to expand on it. Is that the idea that our museums are the type of museums that we're set up to be generally come with that kind of established audience, or if you're new museum, you maybe have a target audience set. But museums in our communities often expand our traditional narrative by being more representative of communities not previously evident in the museum. And this is often seen in itself as activism, or being PC, or even rewriting history. And there can be that fear of, within our institutions as well, of alienating our traditional audiences when expanding narratives and including new audiences in it. But have you ever experienced any pushback from your traditional audiences in this way? I think Sarah definitely touched on it in her presentation, but does anybody want to talk about any feedback that they've had from audiences?
Well, as I kind of mentioned in my presentation, we have had pushback, and for example, in our work on the Troubles and beyond, we would sometimes get viewpoints that just leave it well alone. We've all had enough of this. We just want to come to the museum for a nice day out and look at some beautiful art and go to the cafe. Why do you have to keep raking this up? And then, I mean, the year that we've all been through, I think some of the pushback has sometimes got a bit nastier about museums being woke and just kind of knee-jerk reactions to kind of agendas as people would see it, and people can be very critical of that. And in our kind of discussion prior to today, I think we were kind of saying, but a lot of this isn't actually activism. Again, what we're just doing is good historical practice. Museums should be there to give the full picture and to give a much more rounded, thorough and honest view of history, and indeed the present as well. So we obviously are very respectful to all views that come our way, and if someone puts in a complaint, we will respond to it, but we will stand our ground if we feel this is work we really should be doing. And again, that's where the ethics can back us up and support us in what we're doing. And harsh as this sounds, I think you will lose some people along the way, but museums have always had to evolve, and they always will have to evolve. But the best we can do is to really kind of make clear that we are these spaces for discussion, and all views are welcome, and how we encourage people to participate in that. So, just for example, one of the criticisms we would have had is the young people working on a project. They're very pro-choice in their views, so there was a lot of material that they brought forward, which they had every right to do in the project and was displayed in the museum. People contacted us and said, but we're pro-life, and where are our voices? And we would like to collect those and share those as well, but it was a question of them coming forward. So that was an instance of not the museum being one-sided, but the young people being one-sided, which again, as I say, they're absolutely entitled to do. But it's just something we need to be mindful of. If we're saying we genuinely are here for everyone, how do we represent that?
Yeah, I have to say I had the same problem myself in collecting Repeal the 8th, that there was a wealth of material culture that was ready and available to collect from the pro-choice side. But there was, while I asked for the no side to contribute material, I got nothing back. So it was quite much more of a hard slog to try to go out and have that side of the debate represented as well. Simon, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I was just wondering, because you've been in the unfortunate position of having opened a museum and been forced into closure like almost immediately. You said that you've gone online, and I was just wondering, do you have any experiences of this kind of thing in terms of feedback even online?
I mean, thankfully not actually. I mean, we did have, I mean, in terms of pushback, and I don't think, I mean, listening to it, looking at the work that Hannah does, I mean, that's really, I mean, that's at the coal face of this type of tension, right, that exists, I think. So any of my examples are just really in the halfpenny place. But I mean, one of the things that I did experience pushback a tiny bit once on was that actually what we were presenting within the museum didn't kind of emphasize one writer or another particularly as much as somebody would have liked. And you know, it's an interesting thing because in a way you have a situation there, and Hannah has kind of alluded to this as well, of people wanting to kind of constrict the narrative as well, which in itself is probably more of a political act than complicating it. I mean, I remember that coming up to the centenary of the 1916 Rising, the historian and archivist Katrina Crowe, I remember talked about the need for museums and public organizations to complicate the narrative. I thought it was a really great phrase that she had. And in a way, that's probably the most apolitical thing that we can do. When politics gets involved in these things, it's when it kind of seeks to constrict and control the narrative. But I think the challenge that we have as museums is we will always be seen by the nature of the types of organizations we are as politically liberal, whether we are or not. So there's a challenge there, I think, to make our spaces safe spaces for people who are coming from areas of the political spectrum where they don't identify with that liberalism. I think that's a big challenge. Yeah,
it is. Kind of along those lines, and something that we kind of touched on before when we were talking before this session, we were looking at the more recent culture wars and the bringing down of statues and that whole idea of who gets to write history. And these discussions bring up that idea. Who decides what history is? Some questions of the validity, and certainly I've had this myself, that the audience members or community members will comment that, well, how can you collect this? You don't know if this is going to be history or not. My argument is generally that sometimes it's just really obvious that this is history in the making. But it does bring up that idea of, that whole politicization of who gets to write the history books, who gets to decide what the history is, and how different museums can be, that we can hold material culture that tell that slightly different story, or that complicates that narrative, and that maybe a history book doesn't quite do. And so it's just wondering wanted to throw that out there and see what you think.
I love the idea of complicating the narrative, and it's something that I really like to do when we do, especially schools activities, but any tour or anyone we're talking to, to try and talk about history as really fluid. The history in the book has been nailed at that particular point, but it's always moving. That it's being revised, and it's interesting for us as a museum that kind of to some extent interprets the penal laws. Because they're under revision at the moment. Again, I think, and I was at a conference in Dublin, and it was like they hardly impacted anyone's life. Nobody noticed them even, and nobody lost anything. And they've all been terribly overstated. And it's interesting for us because we have a convent that's hidden in the middle of a block with massive bars on the door and deadbolts, and we have Nano Nagle's letters that talk about her fear. So it's interesting to kind of introduce that idea to students, that history is actually, it's moving. So that history book, that narrative in the history book is, it's at this point in time, and it will change, or that we need to go back to primary evidence to kind of keep revisiting what history means to us now. And they kind of give me very strange looks because history education we're still quite textbook based here in Ireland. So it's exciting to tell them to not read the textbook too carefully.
Definitely, yeah. And certainly it's really exciting when you can bring an object out to a student and it just throws off all of their ideas completely and kind of blows their mind and makes them think just that bit more critically, and just really kind of teaches them that, history kind of more like a science than anything, and that more information, the more you adjust your ideas about what happened, and that it's an ever-moving feast, as I said. I just want to, just a kind of a last question before we pass over to audience questions, kind of a bit more of a fun one. That, we're talking today, we're all fairly, if we've been working for 10 years or 20 years, it's still kind of almost fairly new to be doing this, but in fact, museums have been doing this to different levels of success, usually due to pushback from funders or communities, or a museum's remit, that museums have been doing this for quite a long time. For example, the National Museum has been working with the travelling community for well over a decade now to at least try to help address long-standing prejudice against them. And we've definitely, there's been lots of local museums around the country who've been doing the same thing for even longer than us. I was thinking as well about how the museums in Liverpool have been discussing the city's own role in the slave trade and the wealth that created for the region. It's been doing that since the 1980s, and it's done particularly well in the new incarnation of the Museum of Liverpool, which was just fantastic and was really quite an inspiration to me, along with a number of other museums. And I was just wondering, do any of you have any kind of exhibitions or museums in mind that you look to as a good example of doing this right, that has, you know, brought you some inspiration?
I always joke that in the museum sector we always steal from each other, but we encourage each other to do that, and I think that's something lovely about. Like, I work with some people who come from a very commercial world, and they find that strange that we are all so happy to share, and we want to learn from each other. I'm going to pick two examples, I think. One is we are in the early stages with others of developing a new conflict and legacy network for the island of Ireland, which is looking at the troubles and their legacy today, and it's bringing together museums and heritage organisations that work in that area. And one of the kind of founding organisations with us is the Museum of Free Dairy, and I think they're really interesting in that they are a genuinely campaigning museum in a way that we certainly aren't. So they do cover all those traditional museum functions around collecting and exhibiting, but they are about social justice, they are about dialogue, they are about peace building, they are so proactive in what they do. So I think we all would have something to learn from the way they operate, and just their passion and commitment to their cause. And then the other is the People's History Museum in Manchester, which I think has a really lovely strapline of ideas worth fighting for. And they've done some really good collecting and some really clever exhibitions in recent years, to mark the centenary of the Representation of the People Act, for example, and an exhibition about LGBT plus rights. So they're one that I would look to. I think they're very progressive in their approach, and they're all about democracy. So they're worth taking a look at.
I'd throw in a few actually. I'd be duty bound to kind of mention the Little Museum of Dublin, where I first worked in this sector, but particularly because I suppose the policy there was always to, when Hannah mentioned being democratic there, it was always to just present as much as possible at the same time about the city from every single angle that we could. So there was a kind of a deliberate chaos to it. But it was interesting, the reaction of the public to it, because it was, I think it was kind of quite early on publicly talking about day-to-day material culture. We didn't kind of know that was a phrase at the time, but I mean, that's what the museum was doing. I thought it was kind of, it was valuable work. I think the Tenement Museum in Dublin is a really, really interesting example of a way of completely thinking differently about a physical space and the way in which it can tell and contain kind of narratives of people who are connected to that space, and actually people whose narratives have nearly completely disappeared from view. So I think it's and it's just really beautifully done. And then on a bigger scale, I always really admired the Museum of the City of New York, which, although it's a kind of a large museum, deals with these types of subjects, both in the immediate present and in the past as well at the same time, and always in really interesting kind of ways and very experimental ways.
I was going to say the Tenement Museum.
Sorry.
I love what they do. I love what they do. I love that they make the museum a home where you get to have a cup of tea after your tour. Like, they're interpreting the space really well. And I suppose I'd have to say I really have enjoyed the work of Anu in interpreting that space over time. And one for you, Brenda. I thought Anu's work in Collins Barracks around the regiments of Friends was one of the most hairs on the back of your neck stand-up experiences I've ever had in a museum ever, actually.
Yeah, it was agree.
Stunning. And I think I went to it 12 times. I tagged on to the end of the tour because I worked there, so I just tag on. And I would spend the entire performance just going, how do they do this? And how as a museum practitioner can I connect this strongly to somebody who comes in through our doors, the way that they're connecting with them? And I've never found an answer to that, except for maybe getting Anu into your museum to do that all the time, which is not possible, unfortunately. I have to give a shout out to my favorite museum in Denmark, which is the, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it in Danish, but it's the Danish Welfare Museum, and the work that they do there is absolutely incredible. It's a site specific. It's an old kind of workhouse care home slash. It's difficult to describe. It's kind of like a workhouse. So people, when they went onto the welfare system, they ended up in one of these homes. But they have moved their narrative of explaining the home into the whole narrative of the idea of institutional care in Denmark and the welfare system now, which they're very proud of. And it really challenges what is there to be proud of in that system. And it really focuses on the stories of people who have been through the system, right to the point of actually giving them opportunities in the museum to learn skills and gain employment, which I think is probably, it's my OG at this point for a site-specific museum, I think. But I think the work that you were all doing is absolutely amazing, and we're making great steps in what we do. I'm going to check to see, is there any questions coming in from any of the participants, or sorry, any of the audience members? I don't see anything on the chat, but if any of the hosts can just confirm that.
Yeah, I can confirm that, Brenda. There's no questions. So encourage everyone to ask all the questions to these wonderful panelists. And you can, of course, use the Q&A box down below. We're monitoring that, so you can just pop your question in the Q&A box, and we'll monitor that and pass it on to the panelists. And I would say keep going. This is really interesting, guys.
I think I've run out of questions. Have you any further thoughts, or any, to use this as an opportunity to say something to audiences of your museum? That I really put you on the spot there, didn't I?
I thought something to add in, actually, Brenda, just when you were talking earlier on about contemporary collecting and the kind of idea of pushback against that. And I mean, I heard about that kind of pushback years back when we were kind of collecting for the little museum, and it was interesting, actually, that people were saying, oh, you can't be collecting anything for like 30 years, but I mean, if you look at the history of most museums, I mean, most museums only exist because people were collecting, and oftentimes a lot of museums have to depend on the collections of amateur collectors to create exhibitions, because that's, because they do this unencumbered, and where I think it can be a kind of an emotional question for some people to ask. I think for the museum professional, it's really just a kind of a technical question, which is, how do we collect everything and store it without it bankrupting the organization? I mean, it's like, it's simply a technical process, but it is interesting that there's kind of that there's pushback, or people experience that.
Yeah, I mean, it brings home the point that generally a collection in a museum, a lot of it has not been chosen by the curator. So while we make choices in order to take it in, and we might refuse some if there's duplication, the first step in curating an object into a museum is made by the person who's offering it for donation or for sale. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the times it's been very passive collecting in museums, and we inherit the collections that we've got. Myself and my predecessor, Larjoy, often talk about the sea of red when it comes to the military uniforms in our collection. And basically what we're saying there is that it's the uniforms of the officers and the commissioned officers. And it's usually because they maybe came from a family that was in the military tradition, and it was valued, it was part of their family heritage, and it was kept and therefore passed into the museum. And we had absolutely nothing that belonged to the other ranks. So it was completely misrepresented. So we have been working very hard over the last 20 years to try to rebalance that kind of collecting. And you can really see it in some areas. Quite coincidentally, back in the 70s, the museum took in on loan a full dress uniform of the, sorry, I'm going military geek now, by the way, sorry about this. We took in the full dress uniform of South Imperial Yeomanry. And what was refused offered at the same time and refused was his ordinary dress uniform and his ordinary uniform and items that represented his time in World War I and even in a German prisoner of war camp. So that really showed where the interests of the museum were at the time and how our interests have changed. And when you apply that to contemporary collecting, well, first of all, recent experience shows that, well, objects are much more disposable now. So it's kind of, you either collect it or lose the opportunity. But what you must have is a robust deaccession and disposal policy in order to deal with that if it turns out that you've maybe been a little bit rambunctious in your collecting. But it's certainly, you know, past collecting practice can definitely inform how we collect today in contemporary material. But I would also say that nothing that happens ever comes out of nowhere. So, you know, the repeal the 8th, marriage equality, the Black Lives Matter movement in Ireland still has its roots in 20th century Ireland. So these things have a history already that we haven't collected. And when they become issues now, we can certainly grab that opportunity in order to correct that imbalance. I've got a couple of questions coming in on the chat. So this one is from Lisa. Thanks everyone. Are Irish museums informing school curricula in history at present? It's notable that, for example, the junior cert curriculum has a stronger focus on artifacts and other forms of material evidence than previously, which is an interesting question. We talked a little bit about this before as well, about how school curricula kind of equaled visitors in a very traditional view. But yeah, so that question from Lisa about a stronger focus on artifacts in the junior cert.
I think the new history curriculum for junior cert cycle does actually include a museum visit, it's built into part of the cycle, which is great to hear, because I think all of the research suggests that if young people go to the museum, if the barrier of going to the museum is broken, you know, during a school visit, and it becomes normal to a child to know how to use museums, then they'll keep using them, which is, I guess, you know, Graham Black says, get them while they're young. So it's interesting though, isn't it? We're kind of, we're talking about the museums informing the curriculum. I think at the moment the curriculum is maybe sending young people towards us, but I'm not sure that we're really informing it in any way.
We obviously have a different curriculum in Northern Ireland, but we are trying to be a bit more bolshy, I suppose, at going to talk to the curriculum authority and saying, don't just have kind of artists or historical subjects you can go and see in London, or that are just the big names. Try and bring it back to these kind of real treasures you have here at your disposal, and that in a way almost any school child could come and visit our museums. So trying to focus them more on that, and we've been doing that particularly around our Troubles collection and around the decade of centenaries as well. But I think it's something we've learned we have to be quite proactive about, partly otherwise people don't realise what you have.
Yeah. I'll go on to another question because I think we might be running out of time. So a question from Lucy. Brilliant talk. Thank you very much. I wondered whether any of you have any thoughts on art repatriation or projects or similar. Sorry, I'll say that again. Have you any thoughts on art repatriation projects or similar, such as that of the Oxford Pitt Rivers Museum, as part of which the museum is highlighting the fact that many of their items are spoils from the processes of colonialisation?
I don't mind talking to this because it's probably not so relevant to the collections of the others, but unfortunately it is to us. It's something that we are very supportive of, and we are at an early stage, but we're in a number of conversations at the moment. Museums have what are called collections development policy, and they have these kind of awful sounding categories for disposal, and it's reasons we might transfer objects out of our collections, and sometimes that's because we have duplicates, sometimes it's because something is in a very bad condition. But one of the reasons we have is about repatriation, and if a community makes a request for an object to be returned, that is something we would always explore. So for example, at the moment, we were contacted a year ago by an organisation in Australia, which is looking to gather more information on Aboriginal collections around the world. And so we provided information for them at that stage. It didn't result in repatriation then, but now they've got funding for a further stage of the project. So it's a conversation that's open, and we are just interested to see where it goes. You mentioned the Pitt Rivers Museum there. They have just started a new project called Devolving Restitution, which is about involving museums around the UK and community partners in discussions about restitution to Africa and what we need to be doing there. So we find it's a long process, but like so much, dialogue is key to it, and we welcome any requests that come our way.
Yeah, I'm going to say something as well about the National Museum of Ireland practice in this area. We've actually there's been an ethnographer looking at our ethnography collection for possibly 15 years now or more. And there's a real concentration on where exactly did all of our ethnographical material come from. Because of course we're in that situation where we were a colonized country, but we also participated as part of the British Army in colonizing other areas of the world as part of that army. So we have those responsibilities when it comes to the objects in our collections as well, and that's what we're looking at. One of the problems, why it takes so long, I think Hannah would agree, is that very often with these things, they came into Europe in the 1700s, records are very sparse. That is one, and certainly with our collection, a lot of it actually came in through the RDS, so or through Trinity, so it has that extra layer of not having records as well. So that's what we're looking at the moment, and we've got a provenance committee set up to try to actually pin down where exactly all of this came from. In actual fact, I think the National Museum of Ireland repatriated some objects. I think they were human remains mainly back in the 1970s. So we do have history of doing it, and if anybody comes to us specifically about something, then the doors are open. So yeah, it's an interesting question. It's going to be quite a long haul in terms of getting all of our information together, but it's conversation that we're having. So another question. I'm trying to figure out which one came in first. Do you ever find yourself leaning one way or the other with unconscious bias when putting together an exhibition, or I suppose in my case, collecting? I think I'll start with that one. I think it's impossible. I think you have to acknowledge that you have a stance on something. If it's a political issue, you're a citizen. A curator is a human being, and they're a citizen, and they vote. And of course, they have political ideas and thoughts and leanings. And one thing that you have to do as a curator is actually look at things from both sides and being totally balanced. And I know how I tried to do that is to make sure that I talk about it to as many of I bend the ear off as many of my colleagues as possible, and people outside the museum as well. They're sick of me talking about it, about how, you know, if I'm going down the wrong path, or if I'm leaning too heavily in one way. So I don't know how everyone else kind of thinks about that.
I think it is, as you say, very difficult, and it's asking second readers to have a look at what you've written. And just we did an exhibition this summer called Small Lives at Home in Cork in 1920. And it was hard not to feel emotional, because we covered the burning of Cork city centre, and which was essentially the destruction of one side of the street in a kind of a drunken night of madness. And it's hard not to be emotional about it, or not to say, oh, that, you know, that was wrong and the people who did it were awful. So I think I think you'll always have unconscious bias, but it's so important to just, as you say, Brenda, like air it. And I had a friend who worked in the Imperial War Museum who second read the exhibition and just helped me revise out my unconscious bias. You know,
I recently revamped the Irish War of Independence and Civil War section of the Soldiers and Chiefs exhibition, and that definitely required making sure that there was utter balance in everything. Having an academic committee really helps in this way. Or if you don't have an official academic committee, to have people you trust academically to read over things and set you right on certain aspects. Having said that, you can't hide the truth either. But so the stance that we were taking was that, you know, there was wrong on both sides, and we were trying to make sure that examples of those wrongs equaled each other. So one thing that was particularly interesting about that exhibition was the hair that had been shorn from a woman in a bobbing or shearing, punishment shearing. So a woman would have been seen as maybe either having a relationship with a member of the RIC or Oxy or British soldier, and would have been punished for that. Or on the other side, a woman would have been punished by doing that for her association with the IRA. What was nice about the hair was that it was actually, it was an IRA shearing. We didn't have access to anything else. These objects don't come along very often. So it is a spectacular object, but in the witness statements, you could find examples, and the newspapers, contemporary newspapers, you could find examples of both sides actually carrying out this action. So it was also a good object to show that this happened, it was perpetrated by both sides. So it's something that is always to the forefront, I think, when you're curating something that is difficult. We might even go overboard with it in terms of making sure that we're balanced. Any question from Niall? Any advice to volunteer curators of community-run museums on appealing to the non-traditional museum visitor without necessarily changing the narrative or focus of exhibitions? And in brackets, I assist in such a museum which mainly tells the local Irish Revolution story, which by its nature can sometimes feel exclusionary to some in the wider community.
Yeah, I'd have a few things to throw in there for Niall. The first, I suppose, is that the most important audience, if you want your museum to be successful, are the ones who aren't interested in your subject matter, because they're much bigger than the audience that are. I think making sure, and this is all going to sound really, really, really simplistic, making sure that they have really comfortable places to sit when they arrive at your museum. Make sure that they have places to park buggies. If they have children, make sure that that the bathrooms are actually attractive as opposed to just functional. All of the things that contribute to a better day out for people. I think that's really, really important. And I think actually holding the hand of your audience in every way you can as you lead them into the difficult exhibition is really important as well. So that it's a place that they're comfortable in, and just kind of in educational principles, that they're happy to be there and to be taught something.
Okay. There's a comment from Lisa with regard to the curriculum question. There are pockets of activity in museums here working with schools to devise object-based learning packs, objects and activities that will be available in schools. And she's doing some of this work in relation to the new junior cert curriculum on behalf of Tipperary County Council. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely museums out there are doing great work in terms of trying to engage children or students or learners of any age or in all ranges with the artifacts that we have. I know in larger museums it becomes the job of the education department to do this. So I feel sometimes quite detached from that when it comes to a certain point when the exhibition is up. It almost feels like you've had a child and then you have to pass it over to be raised by somebody else. But certainly I do know that the National Museum of Ireland has great learning packs that are objects based. I think as well with COVID and us all having to go online, we really were, even if we weren't doing it before, we were really forced into looking at what we can provide online to schools when it comes to our artifacts. Does any of your museums, when it came to going online, was anything new produced that you felt kind of, God, I should have done this a while ago if we'd had time?
We did a kind of blended learning program when we came back last autumn to delivering to schools. So our education would deliver from the museum, but in advance we'd drop off a loan box. And so while they were teaching effectively from the museum, they would mention objects that the children had in school. And in some cases they'd have copies of the objects, so that the education officer would be holding something and the children would be holding it as well. And it's such a simple idea in a way, but it's been really, really effective. And so COVID forced us into that kind of model of working, but because it's been so successful and it's really increased the geographical reach of our education service, it's something we will definitely be continuing even when schools do come back on site.
Yeah.
Yeah, very similar experience for us as well. In MOLI, I would say actually post-pandemic, I imagine 80% of our learning activity will be online because the geographic reach is so much, as Hannah says, it's so much broader. And actually really effective, and schools have all been set up ready for this for years. We just didn't know it.
Yeah, very much the same. I think Zoom is just such an incredible tool, you know. And so Nano Nagle, or Judy, the actress, zoomed into, she spoke to 650 students in 1 week in November during presentation week, and it was so exciting. I got an inquiry from a school in Perth about something today, and I wrote back and was like, would you like a virtual tour on Zoom? How amazing to be able to offer that. And you know, so COVID has been both awful and a real kind of catalyst for changing the way we're doing things, you know, in the education side of things. Yeah, certainly it's forced a new way of working, but there were definitely opportunities in that, in terms of either if you're going to bring your laptop around an exhibition to give a personal or a class tour of an exhibition, or even going into your stores and bringing out artifacts to show to people on screen, which we'll see. I mean, like, is that different to looking at it through glass? I kind of think it might be, because there is still more of a personal aspect to it, even, you know, than when it's behind glass in a normal museum display. I'm going to have to wrap up here because the Lord Mayor is going to say a few words. So I just want to say thank you to you all for being such amazing panelists. It's been a fantastic discussion. I think I've learned a lot, certainly. So I'm going to pass you back to the hosts to talk to the Lord Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, we would like to invite the Lord Mayor now. Give us just 1 second as we set things up. And if the Lord Mayor wants to come on, we'll just get the tech ready here. 1 more second. Then let me just turn off mine. There you go. And okay, the Lord Mayor is almost there. Hello, yeah. Lord Mayor John Kavanagh. Give me 1 second and you'll be ready to go. Okay. So I think we can all see you. So the stage is yours. Thank you very much, Councillor John Kavanagh.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to Brenda and to Hannah Crowdy, Simon O'Connor and Danielle O'Donovan for very engaging discussion on so many topics. And I listened with interest. I listened to it at the start and I said, oh my God, I hope this holds my interest, because I had 3 or 4 other things buzzing away on the sideline here. And but you know what, I was glued to it. It was so interesting. And every contribution had something there that I certainly had an interest in. I was particularly taken with one particular comment that Hannah Crowdy came up with there, and she pictured this and showcased it so well. She framed it so well. She said, telling stories of our past, challenging our present, and shaping our future. And I suppose that particular concept could be, I suppose, used in so many different situations today, life today, and everything we do on a daily basis. in all our strategies and so on. I thought it was really, I was really taken with that. And in terms with one of the panelists discussed Frederick Douglass, and I was very interested to look at it, and I researched him a little bit, and his links to Belfast and Cork were very interesting. And you know, in our current state of affairs in terms of our international relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and United Kingdom and so on, and the present day difficulties between North and South in terms of the border and the Brexit and the difficulties that presents from so many different perspectives, divided community element on it over the century, etc. We could do it bringing Frederick Douglass back, really. I'd say he'd sort out an awful lot of our problems from so many different perspectives. And I suppose there was a lot of common sense spoken in the discussion earlier. I'd just like to mention the Cork Migrant Centre. Since I became Lord Mayor, I had the pleasure to meet and engage with the Cork Migrant Centre. And to be honest with you, you can't help but to be filled with enthusiasm and positivity when you talk to the young people involved in the Migrant Centre. And I remember when I was speaking to them, I was telling them how proud we were of our the international fabric of society now in Ireland, and particularly in Cork, and where we were and where we have come to, and where we want to go to. They're going to have a huge part to play, because we're now an international city. We're an Irish city. And I've told them, and I was quite clear, and I meant what I said, they're as Irish as I am. And, you know, I know people sometimes have difficulty integrating into society for so many different reasons. But, you know, I, as Lord Mayor, reached out, and I will continue to reach out, because we are all living in the same country, we're all living in the same city, therefore we're all citizens of the same city. And I couldn't help but be taken by the positivity and the determination of these really vibrant young people who want to play such an integral part of the future of Cork. And we're lucky to have them in our community. I also, the Cork exhibition, Danielle, I had the pleasure of meeting Danielle up in Nano Nagle Place, and I love going back there. I go back there every day if I could. But it's such an amazing transformation of a very historical building right in the center of Cork City. And we've breathed so much life into this building, and it's people like Danielle and her team up there have really generated something really special in our city. And the exhibition, and Danielle mentioned it earlier in her comments when she mentioned the burning of Cork. The building you see behind me here, the City Hall, was burned to the ground by the British forces on the 11th of December, 1920. Or the 12th of December, sorry, 1920, and was completely and utterly rebuilt. And that's the building you see behind you, and reopened in 1936. So us Cork people and us Irish people are very resilient. Our city was burned to the ground, but like a phoenix, we rose from the ashes, and we're back now. And we're the second, as somebody said to me, we're the second largest English-speaking city in the EU. And there's more to come from Cork. Somebody mentioned something that's very close to my heart. You mentioned curriculum, or the curricula in the schools and so on, in terms of history and so on. It's something there's two aspects of the school curricula I've always had an interest in and a bit of a passion in, and I've always scratched my head and wondered why they are. The first one is obviously teaching of languages. I think in schools in Ireland is nothing short of a disaster. Students are taught to write languages, not to speak them. You go to the continent, you meet a 10-year-old child and they can speak fluent English. You go here in Ireland, you go to school for 13, 14 years studying and maybe spend 10 years studying a continental language, and we can't string two words together unless you specialize at a third level. So I think it's something that needs to be looked at, but also the history of our country and the history of our city here in Cork, which is I'm very passionate about, obviously. I'm not sure that it's as meticulously put together as you would see, as Danielle would ever agree with me on. The type of information that the likes of Danielle has now up in Nano Nagle Place as part of the Burning of Cork exhibition, you know, is that taught in schools? Is it taught as thoroughly as it should be? Because, you know, if we don't know where we come from, we really don't know where we're going. And I think that it brings me back then, just to conclude, to Hannah's presentation, telling stories of our past, which is what we should be doing in schools, challenging our present, which is putting proper, meticulous, factual curricula together for our students, and this will effectively shape our future moving forward. So thank you again for everything. It was absolutely brilliant. I could listen to you all day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lord Mayor. That was amazing. Thank you so much. I'm glad that you joined. Thank you very much. And yeah, that concludes our panel. So thank you, everyone, for being here for this really amazing panel. I could have gone on for forever. I really loved and enjoyed listening to you all. So thank you very much, and enjoy Douglas Week. I hope we'll see you all again. Thank you very much, Danielle, Hannah, Simon. Thank you so much, Brenda. Wonderful. And Lord Mayor Joe Kavanagh, thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.